Okay, we are into April, and the class is going to end at the end of April, take a break for the summer, start up again in September. My plan, we'll see how well this works, is to post, what shall I call them? PowerPoints with commentary, with my voice over, on various topics during that break. So I will send out an email to this class. I will post on my YouTube channel. I'll put on my blog, so whichever way you find me, and perhaps they will even post them on the stake website. I am not sure. We still will need to work that out. But that's where we'll find the ones that I promised earlier this year that haven't been done yet. It's been a busy month. Yeah. So we were just talking about the Ken Burns film, the last two nights on PBS on Benjamin Franklin. And the problem that we have in today's society, dealing with individuals who are amazing and important, and yet in their personal life leave something to be desired. And that's a great description of Benjamin Franklin, because although he was this incredible inventor and philanthropist and politician, more like a diplomat, and really saved the entire idea of the United States of America, he also was a slave owner, and he was a philanderer. And it becomes difficult for us in our society to judge people by the standard of their society, which we don't recognize. That also, and obviously, that's something we're dealing with in the entire book of Genesis. Almost every one of these patriarchs and some of the matriarchs have character traits that are less than endearing, to say the least. You know, they're trying to kill their brother, they have numerous wives, and they're fooling people, and major things. We also have a problem for about half of the population, and this I've written in green over here, and that is that the Bible, certainly the book of Genesis, but almost the Bible as a whole, maybe with the exception of the book of Ruth, the entire book does not pass the Bechdel-Wallace test. Now, we often speak of that, the Bechdel test. It's, does a movie or a book fit some qualifications? Does it have two named female characters? Do those female characters have a conversation with each other? And the third test is there conversation about something other than a man? And 50% or more of the movies made in America do not pass that test. And the Bible, other than maybe Ruth, where you have Ruth and Naomi talking to each other, that may be the only conversation between two women in the entire Bible that is not about a man. And that is upsetting to some women in our culture, because they do not see themselves represented very well in this book. But again, it's because it's from a different culture thousands of years ago, when standards were different. One book may have been written by a woman, and that's Song of Songs, which doesn't make it in to Come Follow Me. We're not reading it this year. Now, I'm reading it, I wrote a commentary on it, but it's a difficult text. So these are problems that we have. Of 3,000 characters in the Bible, 200 are women. We have Ruth and Naomi who talk to each other, but it's often about Boaz or the baby that Ruth has. Mary and Elizabeth talk to each other, but the entire conversation is about their sons. Anna at the temple talks to Mary, but their entire conversation is about the baby Jesus. Mary and Mary Magdalene and Salome speak to each other at the tomb, but their conversation is about Jesus. And that fits because the whole book of the New Testament is about Jesus. But virtually every woman in this book is depicted only in the context of their relationship, usually a sexual one, with their husband or some other man, or childbearing. Occasionally we'll get someone like Deborah, who leads an army to war and is a prophet. But it starts off by telling us she's a mother. So that's her first definition, is as a mother. In a way, then, the kinds of people that we are used to seeing and knowing and being don't show up very often in here. It's as if we're in exile. Pharaoh's advisors can't interpret his dream in the story, and so they turn to an outsider, which is Joseph. And I think that they turn to an outsider because he isn't afraid to speak truth to power. I mean, he's living in prison already. How much worse could it get? It might get better. But I wonder if one of the things that women can do now is to be more like Joseph and show the courage to step up and speak and talk about something other than their husbands or their kids. Now, I realize, and certainly in my own life, those are the most important things in my life. And so it's the fallback. I'm going to tell you what my kids are doing. But to be here as someone interpreting the Bible, this is unusual. Certainly through the last 2,000 years of biblical interpretation, and sadly still in our church today. And so it becomes important, I believe, for outsiders, the people who aren't depicted in the book, to talk about what the book is saying to them and how they read it. Because my experience is that women read the text differently, and they may interpret the dreams differently, and that their voice needs to be heard. And I think that is why the First Presidency called an entire group of women as advisors in Europe. It's a position we don't have anywhere else in the world. But there are women from 6 or 7 different countries who are there to advise the president of the Europe area. Because in their countries, in their society, that's normative. What does that say that we don't have that here in the US? And they certainly don't have it in Africa. They have trouble getting women to accept callings to teach in Africa because it's just not done in some of their cultures. So I hope that this text helps us to say, not necessarily which of the brothers am I like in the story of Joseph and Judah and the other 10 brothers and Benjamin and so forth, and what we've been doing is we talk about a man had 2 sons, and this is still the theme, right? The 10 are all combined together in one, and the other son is Joseph. A man has 2 sons. Okay, there's 12, but we're only going to talk about Joseph and the others as a group almost. So that theme is still following through. But we've only had a man have 1 daughter thus far, and that was Dinah, and we talked about how her voice was not heard last week. Nobody asked her opinion. In chapter 36, and we're going to try and cover 14 chapters today and finish the story of Joseph. In chapter 36, something happens that I think we miss seeing, and that is that when Jacob returns and meets Esau, let's see if I can get that to stand up on the board. Okay. When he returns, crosses the river, and comes into the promised land, at the time, Isaac is living down here in Beersheba. And Jacob moves up here to Shechem. That's where Jacob's well is to this day. And Esau has been living down with his parents, taking care of them. But when Jacob moves into the land, Esau takes his wives and all of his flocks and moves east. And he crosses over the Jordan into the area blocked off here as Edom. That includes the countries of Ammon and Moab. And it mentions one of his grandson through a concubine. One of his sons has a concubine, and they have a son named Amalek. And the Amalekites are going to be the major enemy of Moses and the children of Israel as they are on the Exodus in the next book. So they're descendants of Edom. But I hope you can see, he moves east. What does that mean? It means we're just not ever going to talk to him again. We're not going to hear about him again. And his area includes everything from Ammon in the north down to the Gulf of Aqaba in the south. So if you've been on the trips through Jordan, that's where Edom is. So we're back to a man had 2 sons. And there's some interesting editing going on in the text that lets us know that there are editors like Mormon, it's probably Moses, although it may be someone much later than Moses, because notice verse 36, chapter 36, verse 31. These are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. Can you see how that has to be written after a king is reigning over Israel? To compare them on a timeline. So the first king is going to be Saul. That will be in about 1050 BC. And we're back at like almost 200 years before that, 300 years before that. Okay. First thing I wanted to mention on the board here, well, maybe not first, but certainly one of the first, is 4 different terms. And these are the terms, there's 4 different ones, used for various offices or ways to be a prophet, what we would call a prophet today. And each one is slightly different from the next. We'll see all 4 of these words used in Genesis, but they'll kind of get redefined later on in the Bible. So the first one is roah, which means seer. It's the verb to see. And you're going to find this word used as a major theme in the life of Joseph. He is definitely a seer. Prophet is Nabi or Navi. B and V are the same letter. Here's another one that was used of Abraham, and that is Choseh, which means to see a vision. And a vision is different from a dream. And a dream is chalon, and that's one of the ways that Joseph is a prophet, clearly, is that he is a dreamer. In fact, you will see him described by his brothers in chapter 37, verse 19, when he goes to see them. I'll have to get the map out again. They say, "Here comes the dreamer." Well, that doesn't express what the Hebrew has. What the Hebrew has is Baal Chalom, or Lord or Master of dreams. It's, we've heard the term Beelzebub, right? Lord of flies. Or the Canaanite god, Baal, or Baal. That's this word that is Lord or Master. And so it can be seen as either an honorary term or a very negative one, right? Because it is connected with another culture. And so that's the dreamer. In terms of him seeing and being a seer, in chapter 37, you're going to see it at least 5 times. He saw this, he saw this, he saw this, they saw, she saw, he saw, back and forth. And this is the mark of a prophet in the Old Testament, commentators will say, and that is the use of that phrase that we saw Abraham and Isaac using, where someone speaks to them, Isaac says, "Father," and his father replies, "Here am I." Here am I is what Joseph says when his father talks to him. And so his dad wants him to go down into Shechem now, which is where his brothers are. Now, that gets a little confusing because we thought, wasn't he living in Shechem? Isn't that where Jacob's well is? Well, when his dad died, he moved south. And so Isaac is now living down in Hebron or perhaps in Bethel. Those are 2 places he moves between. And you're going to go downhill from either of those down into what we call the Jezreel Valley. That's where Mount Carmel overlooks the Jezreel. Carmel means garden of God, okay? This is a beautiful green place. It rains there. You've got grass growing all over. It does not look like the wilderness of Judah and Judea down in the south. And so if you're going to pasture sheep, instead of having them wander all over barren hills with an occasional olive tree and some scrub brush, which is what Jerusalem looks like, they're going to be up here where there's rain and green. And if you have the map section in your scriptures, they have photographs that show you just exactly how different it is up there. So Joseph, his father, calls him and says, "I want you to go down and check on your brothers and take them bread." If you're at all a Christian, you begin to see that as typology of Jacob as the father who is sending his beloved son, and Joseph is definitely the beloved son, down to check on his brothers and feed them the bread of life. Can you see the Christian typology? This is going to go through the entire book that commentators, Christian commentators, will see Joseph as a type of Christ in the places he goes, in the things he does, in how he will save his family. And that really begins with the Father giving him the coat of many colors to distinguish him from everybody else. Now, coat of many colors. Coat will be used, I don't know, about 70 times. This word, ketonet, will be used about 70 times in the scriptures, but it's only used of about 10 different people, if that. Maybe it's less than that. And of many colors is only used twice. The problem is it doesn't mean many colors. The coat is this word, ketonet, an unusual piece of clothing. It's the one we talked about when we were reading the story of Adam and Eve, when God made coats of skins for Adam and Eve. He made them ketonim. So it's this kind of coat, the same one that Adam and Eve got. This is the adjective describing it, which is pasim, and that is translated as colors twice when it gets used. Sorry, it has nothing to do with colors. It has nothing to do with embroidery or patchwork or, I've heard all different kinds of interpretations of what it means, this pasim. What it's used as in other places in the text is, it means sole of the foot or wrist or palm. And so the suggestion then is it's long-sleeved and perhaps also long to the ground. Now, in our culture, that doesn't mean much. I mean, I'm wearing a long-sleeve jacket. Some of you are wearing pants that reach the ground. That doesn't mean anything in our culture. But if you are a culture where you have to work, you're usually in a tunic that has no sleeves or very short sleeves. I mean, it's warm over there, right? And it comes to your knees. And when you need to really do hard work, you gird up your loins by grabbing the back of the tunic, pulling it between your legs and tucking it in at your belt. That's how you gird up your loins to get to work. A long-sleeved, floor-length tunic means you're probably not doing much manual labor. You are wealthy. You can afford more fabric, and fabric is expensive. I just saw a piece on a Viking robe that they found in Norway. And they decided to recreate it by weaving it the same way that it was woven. And it took so many hours to collect the wool, dye the wool, spin, card, spin, and weave, that this one robe in today's prices would have cost about $40,000 of labor. Clothing is expensive. You might own one piece of clothing. Perhaps a loincloth, and that would be the men, because they're inconvenient for the women. And that's about it. So to own something that is long to the floor and has sleeves, that's money, and that's saying you're not having to work. You'll notice Joseph is not up with his brothers, or down, as the case may be, downhill toward Shechem. He's not down with his brothers guarding the sheep. The Jews have a really funny tradition. Let's hear it for their midrash. This is one midrash on Joseph. The 10 brothers spent their days in the meadows and mountains of Canaan, advancing their father's successful sheep industry. Benjamin is too young yet to join them. Joseph, on the other hand, is spending year after year absorbed in his father's teachings, in his library. His father Jacob had amassed a great wealth of knowledge, studying at the ancient academy of Shem and Eber in Jerusalem. Now, I don't know if you remember, but there was a midrash about why does Abraham take his son Isaac to Salem? What excuse does he give for taking him to Salem in an imaginary conversation with Sarah? Because he doesn't have a conversation with Sarah. He doesn't say anything in the text to Sarah about what he's about to do. And the made-up story is he's taking him to study with Shem, who is Melchizedek, at the yeshiva, the rabbinical school, where they're learning to read the Talmud. Now, do you notice a slight problem with timeline here? The Talmud won't be written until AD, right? That's after the death of Christ, after the New Testament, after rabbinical Judaism begins. And so you kind of have to let go of timelines. In fact, there are major discussions between two Talmudic scholars. One is Rashi and the other is Nachmanides, and I've mentioned both of those before. And they'll have a discussion about whether anything in the Bible is in chronological order. One will say, yes, it's all chronological, even when we find problems like this comment about, about kings way back at the time of Jacob, when there won't be a king until Saul. So somehow that's still okay and in chronological order. And yet others will say there is no timeline. All things are present with God in Scripture. You know which side I fall down on, because I do that Old Testament timeline thing. But that's a Jewish way of thinking. So you've got Jacob studying at the yeshiva and was privy to all the mystical secrets that get handed down from Joseph is studying, privy to all the mystical secrets handed down from generation to generation, from Adam to Noah to Enoch, then Noah, then Shem, then it gets passed on to Joseph. And so this Joseph as a dreamer is kind of like a college-educated guy, and his brothers are blue-collar laborers. And they notice the difference, and they're not happy about it. You'll see the same problem between brothers in the story of Nephi and Laman and Lemuel, where Nephi is interested in his father's dream, and so he asks, and he receives dreams. But his brothers say, we don't get anything like that. That's not our experience. And they don't believe him. They don't believe an angel came and told him to build a boat. You'll also see that in the story of Joseph Smith. And this is commentary that Joseph Smith will receive when he's working on the Joseph Smith translation with Sidney Rigdon, and it becomes chapter 50 of Genesis, describing a descendant of Joseph in Egypt who will be like Moses. And that's a little confusing because you think, wait a minute, Moses is not a descendant of Joseph, right? Moses is of the tribe of Levi. So you have to read carefully in Genesis 50, Joseph Smith translation, to make sure you're keeping track of which brothers are from which tribes and who the prophesied seer is going to be. But he speaks of a prophet like unto him. And in the Book of Mormon, Lehi will talk to his son Joseph about a descendant who will be named for his father Joseph, who will be like Moses and like Joseph of old. And all of that is commentary on Joseph Smith. The Joseph that we don't talk about, and that I think is the more immediate parallel, is Joseph of Nazareth, the carpenter, the husband of Mary. He is a dreamer of dreams. When he finds that Mary is pregnant, he has a dream. And in it, he is told that the child that she is carrying is the Son of God, and he believes it. Laman and Lemuel don't believe what angels tell him, but Joseph does. He later receives a dream to take his son and flee into Egypt. So we have Joseph going to Egypt in order to not be killed. And then when he's in Egypt, after Jesus is, we don't know how many years old, he is told that the king who sought to kill him, a parallel between Herod and the Pharaoh in the days of the Exodus, right, killing all the baby boys, that he can now return back home again. And so we have Joseph leaving Egypt and moving back up to the Galilee, which is where Joseph of Egypt is buried. His tomb is up in Shechem. And there's another parallel that I think is really important between Joseph of Nazareth and Joseph sold into Egypt, and that is that both of them are men who are in control of their sexual nature. We know that about Joseph in Egypt. Potiphar's wife is trying to seduce him, and he runs. But at the same time, remember that Joseph, after the dream, marries Mary, but knew her not until after the birth of the child. How hard would that be? To be married to someone, to have the right to have intimate relations with them, but to choose not to because of the nature of the child she was carrying, that a child would be born of a virgin. Okay? So that's another way that Joseph and Joseph are alike. The third, I think, is in the coat. Now, when you talk about the cotonet, which is over there on the board, I have listed before who wears one, because there's so few people that have this piece of clothing that you can make a definitive list. And here's the definitive list. You've got Adam and Eve. You have Joseph, the son of Jacob, or the son of Israel. You have Aaron, the high priest, and his sons, the priests at the temple. And that's where most of the uses of this word are, is describing the clothing worn in the temple by those who hold the priesthood. It is also clothing worn by King David's daughter. Her name is Tamar, not the same Tamar that we're going to read about with Judah. She's a princess, and it describes that the children of the king wear this clothing. So probably, maybe even queens do. The sister bride in the Song of Songs has a cotonet. Job wears one. He complains about how the collar of it is irritating a boil on his neck. And then the final individual who wears a cotonet is an individual known as Eliakim. And this is in Isaiah chapter 22. And let me just read you this description. I will clothe him with thy robe, that's your Ketoumet, and strengthen him with thy girdle, and commit the government into his hands. He shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. The key of the house of David will I lay on his shoulder, so that he shall open and none shall shut. He shall shut and none shall open. I will fasten him as a nail in a sure place. He shall be a glorious throne in his father's house. They will hang upon him all the glory of his father's house, the offspring and the issue, meaning he is the one through whom his father has sons and daughters. And in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, the nail that is fastened in the sure place shall be removed, shall be cut down and fall, and the burden that was upon it shall be cut off, for the Lord Jehovah has spoken it. Now that's a messianic image, and one of royalty and priesthood, and in particular even maybe president of the church, right? Having the sealing power to open and shut. And that would suggest then what we continually forget, and that is that Joseph has priesthood. And when you get a description of Joseph, the husband of Mary, it says that he is a just man. Just in Hebrew is tzedek, or righteous. And the first description of him is to give his genealogy, that had the Jews been an independent nation at that point in time, and of course the Romans are in charge, he would have been the king. And it gives his genealogy, which is also the authority by which Jesus is the king of the Jews. And that's a Melech. So Joseph, the father of Jesus, or the dad, stepfather, who raises Jesus, is a Melech Tzedek. And that's the kind of priesthood that Joseph most likely has. Something we don't notice, and that Joseph Smith then restores. That's probably the priesthood that Nephi and Lehi are using, because they are not of the tribe of Levi. So they couldn't be using Aaronic priesthood. Melchizedek priesthood becomes like the description of Melchizedek in Scripture, without father or mother, meaning you don't receive that priesthood because of your genealogy, because you're born into a certain tribe. You receive it because of personal righteousness. And throughout all the Old Testament, we're going to find individuals who appear to have authority from God that is not Aaronic priesthood. So Joseph then is sent down to feed his brothers. And that's Jesus coming down as the bread of life. He's the shepherd. Now, I have a handout. It will be posted on the Stake website under this video, entitled Joseph, the son of Jacob, a type of Christ. And it shows many of the parallels between Joseph and Jesus. As Joseph comes down, his brothers see him and say, here comes the Lord of Dreamers. They don't like this idea that they're going to have to bow down to him. They're sick and tired of him. He's annoying. Years and years ago, the guy who wrote Rough Stone Rolling, Richard, somebody? Starts with a B. Bushman. Richard Bushman's wife, Claudia, wrote an article. It was published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, and it's describing what an annoying person Nephi would have been to live around. Joseph's the same kind of guy. And Joseph is 17. He doesn't understand yet how what he says and does is driving his brothers crazy. And they're all older than he is, right? They've had it. So when he comes, they decide they're going to kill him. And instead, Reuben says, throw him in the pit. Just throw him in this pit, which is a cistern. That's an ironic thing for a type of Christ, that he is in an empty cistern that has no water. This is not just a pit. It's someplace built to hold water for the flocks. And it's empty, which is a good description of the brothers. They are not living water. And Joseph isn't at this moment. And so Reuben leaves, and the Midianites come along, and Midianites and Ishmaelites are relatives. We need to stop and remember that Midianites are descendants of Abraham through his third wife, Keturah. Ishmaelites are the descendants of Abraham through Ishmael. And so these are people they have dealing with regularly. But you'll notice that it's not the brothers who pull him out and propose selling him. It's the Midianites who simply pull him out of the pit, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites who take him to Egypt. But Judah gets thrown in there about, let's sell him instead. Let's put him in a pit and plan to sell him. But they don't, actually. Somebody else makes the profit. And the price that is paid of 20 shekels is probably about right. In the book of Leviticus, it will tell you how much grown males are worth. They're 50 shekels. Grown females are about 30. Someone between 5 and 20 years of age is only worth 20 shekels. So different prices. But of course, it's going to echo Judas selling Jesus, right, for 30 shekels of silver. And remember, Judas is just the Greek form of the name Judah. So as we have their stories interspersed in this chapter, it's like looking at what Jesus is doing and what Judas is doing, okay? They take the torn, they take his coat of many colors, they tear it, they put blood on it, they take it to their dad. And this torn garment is going to be a theme throughout the book. We're going to see it again when Reuben realizes that Joseph is gone, and he, as the oldest brother, is responsible, and he tears his clothing in grief. And Jacob will tear his clothing in grief. It's what is done. And you'll find that garment referred to in the Book of Mormon, that Jacob buries part of it. And when he digs it up, it hasn't rotted. That means Joseph is still alive. So, just as Joseph was saved from being murdered in the desert, so he is saved from being murdered because of his turning away from Potiphar's wife. I needed to mention, while we were talking about clothing, this book, edited by Donald Perry, is he still in our stake? Is he in the other stake now? Anyway, lives here in Salem. He was the editor of this, Temples of the Ancient World. This entire book, all 750 pages, is available free online as a PDF if you search for it. Just put in Temples of the Ancient World, Donald Perry, and it'll bring up the entire 750-page PDF. 2 chapters are on a topic that I think relates well with Joseph. One is by John Tvetnes, Priestly Clothing in Bible Times, and it has illustrations in it. And the other one, the next chapter, chapter 24, is The Garment of Adam in Jewish, Muslim, and Christian Tradition by Stephen D. Ricks. Stephen Ricks' wife, Shirley, is Nibley's editor. And so Stephen Ricks worked directly with Nibley for decades. And his writing echoes that, very much like a Nibley. But those are two chapters that you can get and read on your own that are very interesting, at least in my opinion they were. I've been enjoying this book. Bill Moyers did a PBS series entitled Genesis, in which he met with 6 or 7 different scholars each week for weeks and talked about the entire book of Genesis. And they make some interesting comments about the story of Joseph. And I wanted to share a couple of those comments with you. Page 337. At the time that Joseph is tempted by Potiphar's wife, some will say, look, they don't have the 10 Commandments yet. There isn't a commandment that you can't be having intercourse with someone else. And yet, almost every person I know would say, but having intercourse with someone else's wife just is wrong. Or someone you're not married to. There's something about that that is just wrong. Now, the rabbis will explain the whole situation by pointing out this word, let's see, right here. The description of Potiphar as an officer in Pharaoh's court is not a very accurate translation. Saris means eunuch, and it usually means literally a eunuch. This is someone who has been emasculated in order that they might be trusted around women. And so that's who's put in charge of a harem, for example, in ancient times. So the rabbis will say, well, it's easier to understand why Potiphar's wife is interested in Joseph if her own husband is a eunuch. And in her culture, you need to have children, and you want to have intimacy. And Joseph is the brightest, best-looking person around. The same phrase is used to describe Joseph as the scriptures used to describe his mother Rachel, as being beautiful and fair to look upon. And so we can better understand why Potiphar's wife might be making the choice that she is. So you end up with 3 people who are chaste. One probably didn't choose it. It was chosen for him in his youth. One who is forced to be chaste because she's married to someone who can't be intimate. And the third is Joseph, who chooses to be chaste. That's an interesting issue. There's something beautiful going on here, says one of the people. It's Joseph's developing sense of common humanity. He's growing up. He's loyal to an Egyptian who is his owner. He could have said, I'm being oppressed. I'm going to rip this guy off. If not with his wife, then maybe take his money. But Joseph reaches a kind of maturity and looks across at the humanity of Potiphar, who has power over him, and says, I can't do that to him. He's a human being. He's someone I owe something to. I have this position that he's given me. He trusts me. And it is beyond just this position of power, the trust that Potiphar is giving me. I think it's a beautiful human maturing thing. There's a developing of a conscience in Joseph. And that's something that we really don't see given enough attention throughout the biblical text. we tend to just see cardboard characters. But we see enough of Joseph and his brothers to watch them change over time. And that's a central piece of this story, is how the brothers change. Now, ironically, Jacob doesn't. You really don't see Jacob change. Jacob, when he came into the promised land in our class last week, took the sons of the concubines and his concubines and puts them at the front, where if Esau's going to kill anybody, they're the expendable ensigns, right? With the red shirts from Star Trek, for those of you who know the reference. He does it again here, in that when they bring back the coat, he says, I am bereft. I have only one son now. Hello, Dad? There's 11 of us left. But it's like those other 10 just don't matter. It's only the sons of Rachel that Jacob seems to care about. But you will see the change in others, in Joseph, and of course in Judah and Reuben and others. We get an intermission here, and with Potiphar's wife having grabbed his clothing, and Joseph getting thrown into prison. By the way, the word bos, that he's thrown into the pit, is exactly the same word as the cistern out in the desert. So the dungeon is exactly like the pit. He's back where he started. And he's still a slave. But he's getting older. He's maturing a bit. Meanwhile, chapter 38 is going to tell us the story of how Judah is reacting back home when he's confronted with some temptation. Now, Judah doesn't start out well in this story. He follows in the footsteps of Esau by marrying local Canaanite woman outside of the covenant. Even after his dad went all that way over to Haran to get a wife, Judah just marries a local girl and has 3 sons. His wife, so he has the 3 sons. He contracts with a Canaanite family to get a wife for his oldest son, And we don't know what happens to but it says he makes God angry and God kills him. Dies an early death, leaving Tamar with having had no children. Now, we'll later in the book of Leviticus get a description of levirate marriage, which is that if a man dies having had no issue, his widow is to be taken as a wife by his brother. And the brother will beget children with her that are considered to be the children of the now dead brother, so that his name doesn't disappear. And they will inherit what their father had originally owned. Well, now, Judah takes Er's wife, Tamar, and gives her to his second son, Onan. Now, here's the problem. Onan is a second son. He knows that his older brother, since there's 3 brothers, got half of the stuff, half of the inheritance. And if he begets sons for they will inherit that half of dad's stuff. And Onan doesn't want to lose out on half of the stuff and only get a quarter. So he's willing to marry and have intercourse with Tamar, but he is not willing to beget children, and so he withdraws early. And his name will become a term for that act. In other words, he is willing to have the passion and gratification but none of the responsibility of raising children with her. And so God kills Onan, it says in the text. That leaves only the youngest brother, who is too young to marry. So Judah sends Tamar back to her parents. That is totally unacceptable by the contract of marriage. She has the right to a husband. She has the right to children. She has the right to financial support. And she certainly has the right to not be embarrassed by being sent back home, like she'd done something wrong. So, in the meantime, Judah's wife dies, and Judah goes through the period of mourning. And as soon as that period of mourning is over, he heads up with his friends to shear sheep. And there's parties going on. And Tamar hears that he's coming to the town that she's in. So she veils herself, much like Leah veiled herself the wedding night, so that Jacob didn't know who he was with. You see the parallel there? Veiling is very often associated with marriage in the Old Testament. Rebekah veils herself when she sees Isaac. So this is a marriage intimacy moment. So Tamar veils herself. He thinks she's, and the term in the Bible is kadeshot, which means, how to describe this? Holy prostitutes in a Canaanite religion. There was the belief that if you had intercourse with someone at one of the temples of the gods of Egypt or Canaan, that would increase your fertility. And it probably works in the sense that if a woman has a husband who is infertile and she has intercourse with a male at the temple, she might conceive. And so there's some scientific basis for why this is going on, but it was common throughout much of the ancient world, and it's called hyrios gamos, or holy intercourse. And that's who Judah thinks she is. So he says, I don't have money to pay you. And she says, well, then give me your signet. That's a little roll of clay. I'm sure you've seen them at museums that has an imprint so that when you roll that across wax or clay, it leaves an image. It's like a sealing ring, right? And then the cord that signet is tied on, and then your staff, which has your name carved on the wood, so that when you redeem these items by paying me a goat, you can have these back. That's like he gives her his Visa card, essentially, with his name on it. He goes home, and 3 months later, he finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant. And that has taken away his honor. Remember how last week was all about the honor of the brothers? Dina's opinion didn't matter. Again, the woman's experience doesn't matter here. It's the man's honor that has been lost. And so he hauls her into court, and she, of course, brings out his signet, the cord, and his staff, and he says, she has been more righteous than I. I failed to keep the terms of the covenant of marriage that I made with her for my sons. And so he takes her home. He never knows her again, but she has twin sons. Now, how many twins have been born so far? And again, you have the struggling of twins. One puts his hand out and then it's drawn back in. And doctors will say that when you have a breech birth, it's often with a breech birth, sometimes you'll get one leg and one arm that come out, and the skilled midwife would very carefully tuck those back inside and try to either get 2 feet or turn the child to get it head first, which is the safest way to be born. And so that's what this midwife is doing. But she tied a red cord around the wrist because that part of the baby was born first. That's the firstborn. And of course, then we get the 2 sons, one of whom will replace the other. The younger son is the one who inherits the birthright. Now, Judah had just lost 2 sons, and now he has 2 sons through Tamar to replace them. Someone pointed out that she was owed a kid in payment. She ended up with 2 kids. And these sons will be very much like Jacob and Esau, fighting each other over the birthright. And you hope that somehow, somewhere, this pattern is going to be stopped of the fighting over the inheritance. I find that even among people I know, that still continues to be something that destroys families, of fighting over the inheritance. So, we now go back to Joseph in prison, and it is there, because he was chaste and Judah was not, so he has the same experience that he had with Potiphar. He impresses the people in charge with his abilities to organize. And so the guy who's running the jail puts him in charge and is thrilled to have him. We'll find that the terms we use of butler, right? This is the word in the Hebrew, miskah, and it comes from the verb that means to drink. And so instead of this being a butler who's answering the door, the butler is actually the cupbearer to Pharaoh. We'll see in the book of Nehemiah. Yeah, in the book of Nehemiah. He's the cupbearer to the emperor back in Persia. And the cupbearer means the guy who's testing your wine before you drink it. This is your most trusted servant. And the other guy that you have to be real careful of is the baker who's making your food. And so they would have the person who does the cooking actually eat some of it in front of the king to prove he hasn't poisoned it. My guess is that this is something that Zelensky is a little concerned about right now. Because we know that using poison to remove enemies is something Putin has done before and probably will do again. And it's as old as the hills. And whatever it was these two did, and when it says they offended Pharaoh, the term used there is sin. When Joseph says, how can I do this great sin against God? That's the same word used of the butler and baker. Now, what we miss because of that bad translation of butler is that this is bread and wine and sin. And thus somehow maybe connected with temple or sacrament. So he tells them the meanings of their dreams, which is good for one and not for the other, right? You'll buttle as you did before. But the baker, the birds come down and eat the bread, and therefore his will be the carcass laying on the ground. And it's years later that the butler, when Pharaoh has dreams, remembers, oh, that guy in prison. I was supposed to bring him to the attention of Pharaoh and get him out of prison. Well, now's a good time to do it. And so the butler tells Pharaoh that there's someone who can interpret his dreams. Now, why couldn't Pharaoh's people interpret the dreams? When we read it, that these skinny cows are eating the fat cows, and then the skinny ears of corn are eating the fat ears of corn, and that this is describing a coming famine, we all go, oh, sure. But I'm not sure that his men would want to say, your kingdom is going to be threatened. They want to give him good news. These are his advisors, and they want to say what the king wants to hear. And so that's where I mentioned that maybe Joseph, as an outsider, can tell him the truth, which is, you've got a problem coming, and you need to hire somebody to deal with this problem. And of course, he's describing his own job description, right? And he's clearly the guy to do this. Now, when it talks about ears of corn, this is a word you've heard before, but not in this context. This is the word sibboleth or shibboleth. Depending on where you live, you have a different pronunciation. That continued to be true in Europe among the Jews. The northern Ashkenazic Jews pronounced this letter, the shin, as an SH, and the tav at the end as a TH, so much softer pronunciation, whereas the Jews down in Spain, the Sephardic Jews, this is an S and that's a T. So you have sibboleth or shibboleth. And we can tell where you're from by how you pronounce that word, and that's the ear of corn. Interestingly, even though the majority of the Jews settling in Israel when it was first founded, many of them were from Northern Europe, they chose the Southern European pronunciation, and that's the one that is in modern Hebrew today. So it says ears. It also is translated as rivers, strings. You can just see the rows of the grains, but it is not corn, right? Corn, or maize, is an American food. And it's only after Columbus that potatoes and tomatoes and squash and corn are taken over and become a part of the European or Mediterranean diet. So what we want to see here is barley or wheat. The Old English term kern, K-E-R-N, means grain, like kernel, right? And that gets translated into modern English as corn, even though it really means just grain. Now, when Joseph tells Pharaoh the meaning of his dream, he says, God gave you this message. The word there is, of course, Elohim. What did that mean to Pharaoh? It certainly didn't mean the Most High God of Joseph. And so he's using a very generic language so that Pharaoh will see his own God as the source of this dream, rather than my God has taught you this. I think that was a really wise move. It also suggests a development of the idea that there is a one universal God. The idea that the Jews, the Israelites, in believing in only one God, it's the God of everybody. And that is the new concept. Up until this time, every civilization, every city has its own gods, its own Elohim. And this is kind of introducing the idea from Joseph that there's only one God. And no matter what you might call him, it's the God I worship. And that's who's helping you and who is helping me save my family. But he also saves all of Egypt. And I think we forget that Elohim, this universal God, loves his other children as well. Here's a comment on it. We should remember that Joseph saves Egypt. Egypt prospers because of Joseph's acumen and vision, his activity and energy. Remember the blessing on Abraham? It was that you would receive land and seed and that you would be a blessing. Clearly, what we're seeing is Joseph fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant by being a blessing in the lives of others. And because he blesses others, his own family will benefit from that. There's a gentleman named Hossein who says, did you know that Joseph's success in Egypt had a lot to do with the later Islamization of Egypt? Now, you have to recall that when Muhammad became a prophet and was promoting his religion, he was trying to convert all pagans to the worship of one true God, Allah. And among those that the Arabs came in and conquered were Egypt. People don't pay attention to this, but Joseph is a great prophet in the religion of Islam. To this day, the Egyptians are very proud that Joseph came to Egypt and ruled there. Driving through the streets of Cairo, you will see posters with a verse of the Quran that says, "This is the land to which God sent Joseph." So I think that's an interesting tie-in of how Egyptians see Joseph today. And as an emblem of how high Pharaoh placed Joseph, and to put this into kind of the context, Joseph says we need to save 1/5, a fifth part, that's 20% of everything that everyone grows needs to be put into the storehouses. Now, Egypt is a great place to have storehouses because it's so dry. Grain that was put in the storehouses, the pyramids in Egypt, can be sprouted and grown today. It hasn't rotted in, 4,000 years? So it would be a good place to be able to have storage of food. So this is a kind of a food storage thing. And he's trying to save up enough food to get through these years of the famine. 20%, and you might say, wow, that's a lot. Well, kind of, but someone was pointing out to me, in Canada today, the average person living in Canada pays 39% of their gross income in taxes. In Europe, it's about 40% that people pay in taxes. And the average middle-class American will pay more than 20, especially if you throw in health care, which is paid by taxes in those other countries. So 20% is not bad, but that is the amount that was taxed from people when a war was coming. And so this is being placed in the context of we have a war, kind of like the war on crime, right? Or the war on drugs. This is a war on famine. And we're going into military mode, and you're either going to pay the money or you're going to die. It's in a way like, okay, the women and the old men and the children can leave Ukraine, but the men, you have to stay because this is war. And as an emblem of that war, Joseph is given Pharaoh's second chariot. Now, we think of chariot. I hope you can see the image from the Middle East of a king, Pharaoh, or the head of the Assyrians, or the head of the Babylonians, in their chariot with their bow and arrow. And this is like having Washington on his white horse, okay? This is prime military imagery. So when Joseph rides out in this chariot, which, of course, in the Technicolor Dreamcoat is a chariot of gold, Joseph is being shown as a successful military leader, as a king. But are you recognizing that that is also the image of Jehovah? Jehovah has a chariot. You'll hear about the chariot in the story of Elijah and Elisha, when the chariot of fire comes down out of heaven and picks up Elijah and takes him to heaven. Or when Elisha points out to his servant, how are we going to get out of this city? Well, Lord, open his eyes. And he looks and sees chariots of fire coming from heaven to their aid. They that be with us are more than they that be with them. Now, the chariot, or rekeb, oh, where is it? Right here. Rekeb is the word for chariot, or you can make it a thing for war, and that's Merkava. The Merkava is a description of God's chariot, which you ride to heaven. But the chariot is also the golden chest that the cherubim are on. You go to Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10, and it describes wheels in wheels and the cherubim and the faces of the cherubim and Jehovah seated upon that chariot. You'll see the chariot with Jehovah riding in it around the city of Jericho in the book of Joshua as he fights the battle for them. This is what your God does. This is why you hire someone to be your king, why you support the king, is he's going to ride out at the front of the forces. He's the biggest, strongest, best warrior. That's a real description of Saul. Okay, head and shoulders taller than everybody else. David will grow up into that image. But this idea of the chariot and riding in it is, here, he's the son of God. God being Pharaoh. If you look at Greek culture, who is the son of the Most High God Zeus, who rides a golden chariot, that's Apollo, who rides across the sky every day in his chariot of gold. So Joseph has, in effect, been elevated to a semi-divine status within the country of Egypt. He is seen as the son of God, with Pharaoh being God. And that we probably don't see. He then marries Asenath. And In Nibley's book, Abraham in Egypt, on page 581 to 582, we have a whole paragraph from a book that Nibley translated called The Life of Joseph and Asenath. So it tells her background, tells her whole story, and there's a lot of discussion in ancient texts as to who this woman is that Pharaoh gives Joseph to marry. Some Midrash will say it's Tamar's daughter that she has born from Shechem. And thus, she's a cousin of Joseph. And thus, she's a covenant member. Now, that doesn't fit too well with the rest of the description, but let me read you just a little bit. The first step in the blessing of Asenath becoming an Israelite, because she needs to convert from whatever religion she was. Her father was a priest. And Joseph becomes the heir to Pharaoh, and she needs to become an Israelite. The first step was for Joseph to lay his hand upon his bride and say, Lord God, Father of Israel, who leadeth from dark to light, from error to truth, from death to life, bless this maiden, give her life, renew her through thy Holy Ghost. Now, this is imagery of and language used by Christians at baptisms of turning your back on darkness and heading toward light and then receiving the Holy Spirit. So there's this conversion. She is washed and clothed in white by an angel. He registers her new name in the book of life. From this day forward, thou art newly created, formed, given new life. You will eat the bread of life and receive the anointing oil of immortality. And so you have this conversion of Asenath to being an Israelite priestess worthy to marry Joseph. Now, why do we care? Because she's our ancestor. She's the one who has Ephraim and Manasseh, that the vast majority of the members of the church are descendants of. And if, in fact, as was probably historically true, she was an Egyptian, that's not how we see our ancestry. Because Egyptians are descendants of Ham, right? It's very possible that Ephraim and Manasseh are descendants of Ham as much as descendants of Joseph. And that's not how we want to define it for ourselves. But that may be the reality. We're going to get the blessings upon the 12 brothers from Jacob. And this is the first time that we get the 12 tribes being blessed. It will happen again in the book of Exodus when Moses blesses the 12 tribes. There's a difference in the tribes. We'll get to that in Exodus, where you have the sons of Jacob, 12 tribes, and the 12 land tribes that inherit land in the promised land at the end of the Exodus. Not the same list. Because Ephraim and Manasseh come in and take the place of Joseph and Levi, who gets no land. So, in these blessings, there's a lot of imagery. And these blessings, both in Genesis and in Exodus, were used by Arnold Freeberg when he was hired as the art director for the Ten Commandments. Any of you have the handout, the book that they gave out at the movie? Okay, Mary does. I do. My brother has one in his files. And it's paintings done by Freeberg that were used in the making of the film. And he designed 12 standards for the 12 tribes' flags to carry that have objects on them. And Judah, of course, is the lion's whelp, the Lion of Judah. Ephraim is actually, the Hebrew is actually a wild ox, but the King James translators will translate this horned animal as unicorn. And so the combination of Ephraim, or Joseph, and Judah, that's Ephraim, Israel to the north, the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom of Judah, putting those two kingdoms together into the united kingdom, the symbol is a rampant lion and a rampant unicorn, which is the symbol of the United Kingdom to this day. And there's a great big, huge carved version of it in Boston, where the Boston Massacre takes place in the street. So that's one place that you'll see it. But this iconography is going to continue on down. Manasseh is also a wild bull, different kind. Well, where do we see oxen in symbolism in the church? Right? In the temple, where the baptismal font is on the back of the oxen. And the temple is, in ancient times, especially in times of war, we'll see this when we get to Hezekiah, the storehouse. You take food to the temple to put in the storehouse so that in times of war, you can go inside the walls, not only the walls of the city, but the walls of the temple, and have food to eat. Hezekiah had the tunnel dug, so there would be water inside there as well. So the temple becomes the storehouse where the wheat is gathered. Well, what's the wheat? Right? That's the righteous. And the place of gathering from Genesis chapter 1 is that mikveh, or baptismal font. Who's doing the gathering of the 12 tribes in that temple? Mostly Ephraim and Manasseh. And even the temples built in other places where those tribes may not be in the majority are paid for by the offerings of Ephraim and Manasseh. Those are the birthright sons who have the requirement of taking care of the rest of the family. I hope that as you think about Joseph and Ephraim and Manasseh and the blessings offered to them, which are ours, we also remember our obligations to save the world. Because that's what Joseph did, right? He is, and the name that he's given by Pharaoh can be translated as Savior of the world. That what we are given is not for us to consume, but for us to use to gather Israel and to save even foreigners in times of war. It's my prayer that we will better understand what our covenant blessings obligate us to. And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.